Joining our webinar today, Creating a Corporate Culture That Works for Your Business. Just a couple webinar tips for everybody. If you have any questions throughout this entire presentation, please feel free to put them into the Q&A pane. And a couple other tips, just make sure you're muted and that you dial in using your telephone or your mic and speakers so we can hear you. And now I'd like to introduce our featured speakers today. We have Susan Lamott. Susan is joining us from Exactio, and also we have Alicia Garibaldi, and she is the Senior Content Marketing Manager at Glassdoor. Next, I would just really briefly like to go ahead and walk you through our agenda. So today we're going to start with talking about understanding and figuring out your culture, your core values, and what you stand for. Susan's going to take that over, and then we'll move into how you can build and really strengthen that culture and brand. And then go ahead and figure out how you can align that with your recruiting initiative. And lastly, wrap up with how you can best use Glassdoor to reinforce and just really push that culture and brand out there. So now I would like to pass things on over to Susan.
Great. Thank you so much, Shay, and to Alicia as well for having me today. Just a little bit about my background so that you have a sense of why I'm so passionate about culture and employer brand. I've been in the HR space for almost 20 years, and I've worked in a number of large brands. So I've been in your shoes, in-house, working as a recruiter, working as a recruiting leader, and I also ran the employer brand function for Marriott International, where we won the #1 employer brand as recognized by ERE a couple of years ago. I got really passionate about employer brand and realized that the root of employer brand really is culture. And so now, as the principal consultant for Exactio, when we talk with clients about culture and their workforce and how to promote that through their employer brand, we really start with foundation. Now, I don't have to tell all of you that your employer brand is your reputation as an employer, and that term has certainly been around quite a bit. But what you may not realize is that the foundation of employer brand truly is culture. And employer brand, your employer brand, isn't just about showcasing your job opportunities. It's not about your reputation on Facebook or Twitter. It's really at its core who you are as a company. Now, if you're not investing in your brand and you're thinking about your employer brand just as execution, then you're going to fall behind. So what we're going to talk about today is how to make sure you understand your own culture, and if you don't, how you can plan to understand it and what you can do inside your organization, and then how you can take that and apply it to your employer brand and to existing channels that you may use or may be considering using, like Glassdoor. Now, I'll also mention a couple of things. All of the things that I talk about today will apply to you if you're from a Fortune 500 company or you're from a startup. We do this work, and some of the research that I'll talk about, we do with Fortune 500 companies and small companies alike. So whether you're big or small, whether you've got $500,000 to spend on brand or $5,000, a lot of the things that we talk about today aren't about spender resources. They're really about making sure you get that culture foundation straight. So I want to move on, and we'll talk next about what will you stand for on the next slide. When I talk about culture, the first thing I do is I'll ask a client, what is it that you stand for? And what happens when you ask just that simple question is that individuals stand for a lot of different things in an organization. And one of the things that we forget to do is align ourselves. And the challenge with that is that down the road, it manifests itself in a really difficult way, especially with recruiters. So ask yourself, have you ever asked your recruiters to tell you how they describe the company? Get all your recruiters in a room, have them go around in a circle, and ask them to do that. And the funny thing is, you'll find that many of them may describe the company in a different way. So your first step is to really align the organization and figure out what you stand for. And the best way to do that is to really understand what the heck culture actually is. We define culture as a really simple thing. It's a shared perspective of beliefs, norms, values, and direction. And I'll talk about that in just a second, but I want you to think about culture in 3 ways. I want you to think about it as driving a reason for belonging and a sense of loyalty and pride. Thinking about culture as how it's expressed through words, through actions, and through the environment. So if your company has one location, or like when I was at Marriott, thousands of locations around the world, that culture has to be expressed through every environment where you do business. And then last but not least, it's defined by traditions, consistency, and alignment. So what does that actually mean? Let me put this into visuals, because I'm a visual learner, and I know many of you may be too. And as we move on to the next slide, there's 4 visuals that I typically use to help you better understand it. So if you're talking about culture internally, it'll give you some good metaphors to use. The first in the top left is the shared perspective of beliefs. Now, certainly this isn't a conversation about religion, but I like to use the visual of the 10 Commandments because it's really simple. It's just the 10 rules by which the Christian religion stands, right? So 10 Commandments, really clear, simple, easy to understand, written in stone, literally. So you want to make sure everyone has in your organization a shared perspective of beliefs. You don't want to have core values or cultural attributes that your executive team creates and then you never talk about again. You really need to get them in writing, put them in stone, and make them visually there. Second, in the bottom left, culture means is this shared perspective of norms. So the military is a really great metaphor for this, because if you're in the military and you see ribbons or medals on a uniform, you know exactly what they stand for. And if someone does something and wins a Purple Heart, you know what the norm is. What does that mean? What does that look like? The military is very structured. They have one of the most cohesive sets of norms across all of the branches of the military. What does normal behavior look like? And in the military, if you behave outside of the norm, you're punished for it. If you behave well within the norm and you're living that, like in battle, for example, then you're rewarded for it. So in addition to having, sort of beliefs set in stone, you also have to have a set of norms. You have to be able to say what governs behavior. Next is values. And you'll see the Converse sneakers tattooed on this individual in the top right. I like using this metaphor for values because when you value something, you hold it so close to you that you see it and feel it every day. And tattoos are kind of a representation of that. Most people, when they get a tattoo, they think carefully, you'd hope, about what they're putting on their body because it's going to be there for a really long time. And so if you value something, you hold it really close to yourself. It's something that you don't get rid of. It's how you live your life. So having values, having a guide is really, really important. And then last but not least, on the bottom right, you'll see a framed house. If any of you have ever built a house or gone through that process, you know, or you're in construction, you know that once you frame a house and you decide that there's going to be 2 bathrooms on the 2nd floor, once you frame those bathrooms out, it's really hard to change. So what a strong culture does is it creates that frame. It doesn't mean people can't decorate the way they want, right? Each bathroom could look different inside. But the structure, the walls, the way that they're placed can't be changed once it's put up. And it provides that direction for folks. So when you construct a house and the bathroom is constructed, there's direction for the interior designer as to where everything goes. And it's the same thing with culture. So you can use these metaphors, these visuals to really help you. Culture is a shared perspective of beliefs, norms, values, and direction. So how do you put this into practice? Where do you go from here? On the next slide, we're going to talk specifically about core values. Core values are one of the best things to start with when it comes to culture because it creates that foundation of beliefs and values. Now, for those of you that already have core values in your organization, or for those of you that are thinking about doing it, I want to walk you through a really easy model we use with our clients that you can consider when creating core values. So there's 4 things that values really have to do. The first is they have to reflect who you are as an organization. That means that the behavior of the organization is there. So for example, if you decide, hey, we really want transparency to be a value, but your executive team keeps financial information and decision-making really close to their vest, it's not going to work. Your values have to reflect who you actually are as a company and then has to reflect the behavior of all of the leaders in that organization. Next, your values have to govern how you interact with each other. So again, if transparency is a value in your organization, then you have to be sure that all of your employees are willing to be really open and honest in the relationships they have with each other. So for example, there are some companies that have a passive-aggressive culture. They won't work with a core value of transparency because transparency means if I'm frustrated with you, I'm going to come into your office and say, hey, I'm frustrated. Let's put it all out on the table. Let's talk about it. So the second thing to consider when building core values is that your values govern how you interact with each other, the relationships that you have. Next, in the top right, you want to make sure that your values drive the way that your organization moves. In particular, the decisions that you make. So when you're making a decision as a team, as a group, as a department, a function, even at the senior most level, even when the CEO and he or she makes a decision, it has to drive the core values have to drive that decision. So for example, let's say a core value is innovation, and the CEO is making a decision about taking a risk on something innovative. They're going to look at those values and say, you know what, our values are X, Y, and Z. I'm going to use those as my litmus test to help me drive how I make decisions, how I govern this business. And then last but not least, your core values have to guide your choices. So when you think about executing on projects, when you think about your day-to-day behavior and the choices that you make, again, you can use those values as a litmus test. So core values are great. They're a core part of everyone's culture, sometimes called different things. They may be your culture cornerstones. They may be core values, your core beliefs, whatever it is. But this is where you really want to start as an organization. You want to have a strong set of core values, and you want to make sure they accurately reflect who you are as an organization. If they don't, they'll fall flat because your culture has to be who you are. So keep that in mind as we move to the next slide. I want to share with you a couple of examples of really strong core values that exist. Now, we've talked about, I know many of us have talked about Zappos quite a bit, but I bring up their core values because they're one of the best examples of values translated to action. So when Tony Hsieh, their CEO, makes decisions, he does so based on those core values. So for example, one of their core values is build open and honest relationships with communication. Tony was recently walking through their call centers and realized that the call centers were using a really archaic way that wasn't open and honest for their employees to schedule shifts. And there's actually an article about this in Fortune magazine today. Feel free to take a look at fortune.com. But what they decided to do was shift to an open market model and let people in the call centers bid on shifts because he felt like it wasn't in line with the core values. It's a great example of how decisions are driven by the core values at Zappos. If we move to the next slide, you'll see another great example of core values is at Netflix. Netflix in particular created a set of core values that were so strong, Facebook's COO Sheryl Sandberg actually said it was one of the most important documents ever to come out of Silicon Valley. The reason being is that Netflix so carefully follows their core values, everything they do goes along with those core values. You'll see one of the examples from their core values document here, judgment. And they use that to hold each other accountable. So they'll actually be in one-on-ones or performance management meetings, and they'll pull up this core value. And if an employee has made a decision, they'll say, is this decision wise, despite any ambiguity that we may have around it? So they actually use the words of their core values to help them determine, are we doing the right thing in our business? So I share these two examples. There are many, many more examples of organizations with really strong core values and culture foundations. Ritz-Carlton and the Container Store are two others that are favorites of mine. But in particular, I want you to think about your own culture, what those values are, and do they really reflect your organization? And if they don't, or if you're not sure, we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. So I'm going to move to the next slide. And I want to shift to, okay, how do we use this? It's great to have core values. It's great to think about the importance of culture. How do we think about our culture to be able to translate it to our employer brand and make sure it's going to impact the business? This is the most important thing. So if we flip to the next slide, I want to share with you a diagnostic that we use at Exacquio, my workforce consulting firm, in terms of how to build out those core values. So as you're thinking about your own culture, you've got to be able to put it into practice. It's great to have some bigger metaphors to get you thinking about how to drive the culture conversation in your business. But how do you actually create a culture or recreate a culture if the one that you have isn't strong, or if your core values you don't feel like govern your business. We've developed what we call a culture diagnostic, and I'm going to walk you through it. I'll certainly share all of my contact information, so if you've got questions about this, you can ask at the end of today's webinar, and certainly you can reach out to me after the webinar as well. So there's 4 steps to creating your own culture. The first is collaboration. You want to be able to describe clearly how people work together in your organization. So you need to make sure you have at least 1 or 2 core values that address collaboration. Second is behavioral norms. So this is the way that work gets done. Does work, it can be as simple as, do presentations are they always shared in a deck on a screen? Do we normally get buy-in first before we present a new idea? What are those behavioral norms in our organization that govern success? Third is communication. How is information shared across the organization? So you want to think about things like, how are decisions communicated? How are changes communicated? And that's where, again, this idea of transparency comes in. If you decide transparency is a core value, that falls under communication. And then last is work environment. You want to make sure that your work environment reflects the culture. And the way to think about that is where work gets done. So you want to think about the physical locations that you do business. You also want to think about your online presence, or how people can interact and the tools that they use if you've got a lot of remote workers as well. It's these 4 cornerstones that can help you diagnose and understand your culture. Now, if I ask you to describe these 4 things in your business, if you've been in your company for a while, you could probably do that pretty easily. But what you want to make sure that you don't do is you don't want to make assumptions, because these 4 things are really important to the people you recruit. So think about a candidate who's considering a job at your organization. Imagine being able to tell that candidate, here's how we work together, here's the way we get work done, here's how we communicate and how information is shared in our company, and here's what it looks like where we work. That gives that candidate a really specific perspective and can help him or her self-select in or out of your organization. So that's why it's so important to define these 4 cornerstones of your culture. So if you're considering building your core values, start here. Use these 4 cornerstones to assess what actually exists in your organization in each of these 4 areas. Now, a second ago I mentioned assumptions. You don't want to make assumptions. A lot of cultures are built in boardrooms and they shouldn't be. You want to make sure it reflects your existing culture. Otherwise, candidates are going to be sold a false bill of goods. They're going to be told how great it is. Look at 99% of the careers websites out there that all talk about the same thing, opportunity and growth, and this is a fantastic place of work. We call it breathless language. Instead, you really want to share that reality. So in order to make sure that your culture reflects reality, the best thing you can do before you do anything is to do some research. So we're going to shift to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research. Now, so far, we have talked about the culture itself. How do you understand what the heck culture is and begin to have that conversation in your business, what you stand for? We've talked about how to make an impact on the business. So these 4 cornerstones of culture to make sure it accurately reflects who you are. And now I want to talk about research, which is how do you gather that data that you need to start understanding your culture. So we use a 4-step process that you see here. The first is to get that baseline assumption. So go to your leaders and ask them to describe the culture. See if they even mention the core values. If they do mention the core values, ask them to tell you what it means to you. When we do this work with clients, we do leadership interviews. So we'll start out and do individual interviews with an entire leadership team and ask them to describe the culture. And what we find is often really surprising. In $1 billion company that we recently worked with, a healthcare company, we interviewed 10 leaders, including the CEO and his 9 direct reports. And when we asked them to use 3 words to describe their culture, with the exception of 1 word, all 10 people used different words to describe the culture. Now think about that. If your leadership team isn't aligned about what the culture is, imagine how that then parlays throughout the entire organization, all the way down to your recruiters, or to you if you're vocalizing that culture through your employer brand or through the hiring process. So start with that baseline assumption so you know what you're working with. At Marriott, the assumption was that the culture was all about family. And we had a hunch that that wasn't so much the case anymore as the company had grown globally, but we wanted to start with that baseline assumption. So then your next step is workforce research. Once you've got that baseline assumption, you actually want to go out to your workforce and ask them, what do they think the culture is? How do you describe it? There's lots of different things you can do here. I'm a big proponent of doing workforce research in a similar model that your marketing teams use to do consumer research. So imagine you're Procter & Gamble and you've noticed that Swiffer sales have gone down, for example. And you do some research, some quantitative research, right? Just like we've got our engagement survey data and employee satisfaction numbers. Consumer marketers get their quantitative data. They figure out where it's selling better and worse in the United States. They figure out where it's, what kind of percentage of shelf space does it have in the grocery store. But the quantitative research only tells part of the story. So we can really learn from our consumer marketing friends and also embark on qualitative research. Now, if you can't afford it, it's really helpful to go outside and to find an unbiased research firm. This is the kind of work we do. But to find any unbiased research firm that can conduct this data gathering for you from a qualitative perspective in focus groups. The reason being is employees are never going to tell you directly or tell HR directly exactly how they feel. But when we go in and we take employees off-site and we give them dinner and we get to know them and build a relationship with them, they're open books. And we promise them confidentiality. We don't share the data or who said what back with the organization. We aggregate the themes and the overall data so that the organization can learn and understand. And then that qualitative research can be paired with existing quantitative research that you have. So you've now got your leadership assumption, and you've got a good collection of workforce research that you've done, both quantitative and qualitative. The next step is to really think through what the gaps are between that two sets of data. So what's the same between what your employees and your leaders say and what's different? And your employees are going to really tell you the truth. They're going to be honest and say, yeah, I know we have this core value of transparency, but we don't really think we're transparent. So when you're actually doing that research, if you need to do it yourself, make sure you think really carefully about what those focus group questions are. And then once you align those two sets of data and you do a gap analysis, then you can go back to your leadership team and say, here's the reality of our culture. And it's not you telling your leaders what the culture is, it's you sharing the data back. The data tells the story, both quantitative and qualitative. Now, I know many of us do employee engagement surveys, and I want you to stop and think for a second about the data you collect in your employee engagement survey and ask yourself how people feel about it. So, for example, you might ask a question, do you have the tools and resources needed to do your job? And you might have a really good engagement score on that. Even if you get a really good engagement score, you still need the qualitative data. You need to know how people feel about those tools. You need to know what tools they're actually referencing. And you need to know how those tools are being used, because then you can actually take all of that and share that as part of your culture and part of your brand. So there's a couple things that you need to do here, right? As you're collecting the research, you need to then use this research to help drive your core values. And we talked a minute ago about how to build out those core values. But then you also need to think about the next step, which is how do we actually convey not just our values, but the day-to-day of how work gets done. Now I want to pause here because this is probably the most important part of culture and employer brand that we fail as HR and marketing professionals to deliver. Let me say that one more time. This is the most important part of employer brand. Because if you look at most companies' existing employer brands, they do have that breathless language. They talk at a really big picture level. And if I'm a candidate and I'm exploring, let's say, 2 sales opportunities at 2 different companies, the core of the job might be the same. So what's going to make the difference for me? What's going to make me, a really strong passive sales candidate, come work for you? It's that I have a sense of your culture. I have a sense of how I fit in the organization. And I have, most importantly, a sense of, is the way I get work done as a stellar sales professional the same way that work gets done in this organization? Because if it's not, I won't be successful. So we've added an additional layer to the culture conversation as it to building. And on the next slide, I want to share that with you. We call these work rules. So if I were to ask you, let's say you were a medical professional, a team of surgeons, and I were to say, hey, let's perform a successful heart surgery today. I've got my whole team, and I'm the lead doctor. And I were to ask each one of you, how do we know success has been achieved? How do we know if this heart surgery has been successful? What might you say? Well, some of you might say the patient didn't die. Yep, that's one way to know it's successful. Someone else might say, well, we performed the procedure as we were supposed to. Or we know it's successful because 3 weeks from now the patient's still living. Or it could be successful because we didn't leave any tools in the patient. Or the patient, we operated on the right part of the patient. There's a 1,000 ways that we could describe success. And that's the problem with existing core values and culture, is that if you just leave it at that, then you leave it up to everybody else to interpret what it means. So we would encourage each one of you, as you're thinking about your culture, to not only build out your core values, but for each of those core values, to think about building out what we call work rules. Let me explain what I mean. Let's say one of your core values is innovation. Well, what you want to think about is, what does that look like in practice? So if I'm a candidate and you're telling me one of our core values is that we're very innovative and this company just thrives on innovation. If I'm a smart candidate, I'm going to ask you, well, give me an example. So there's a couple ways you can build out work rules. So for each core value that you build, take innovation, there's 4 things to consider. The first is time. Is there a time parameter to how you innovate? So it might be that you do, innovation reviews of the company once a year, or you have innovation councils, or everyone is evaluated on innovation once a year as part of their performance review. That's one way to build out some work rules around innovation. Second is resources. What resources do you have that show that you're an innovative company? Maybe you've got a special set of tools or technology that other companies or your competitors don't have that allow you to be more innovative. Maybe you've got a chief innovation officer or people in the organization that are responsible for innovation. But you want to build some work rules around resources and access to those resources. Third is outcome. So it helps to build some work rules around the potential outcomes of innovation. So for example, you might say, we test every technology solution against our competitors to see if it's innovative. And then third is activity. How do you behave to show that you're innovative? So we might talk about innovation on the agenda of every team meeting. Those are 4 parameters you can use to consider how you build out your work rules. So think about it. Start with your core values. What are those values? And then what do those values look like in practice? If we're innovative, if we're transparent, what does that actually look like in our organization? And you can consider time, resources, outcome, and activity to govern that. So let me give you an example of exactly what this looks like. On the next slide, you'll see one of our clients, Orr's Partners. They're a staffing firm outside of Philadelphia. And you'll see the core value at the top. We are all responsible for the growth of our business. It's a great core value, and they couch that under the value of accountability. Okay, great. Everybody's responsible. Everybody's held accountable. Well, what does that mean? What does that look like? Am I paid for that? Am I fired if I don't do this? How much growth am I responsible for? Now, underneath that, you'll see 4 bullet points in orange. Those are the work rules. Those are the particular parameters they put in place to help govern that core value. So this really works because in the organization, they know, if you look at that last one, we maintain a competitive spirit, they know that contests are one really good way to hold everybody accountable. We commit to decisions once they're made. They know that decisions are set in stone. And the CEO knows that once he makes a decision, he has to move forward with it. He can't waffle, because that is all part of their accountability core value. So you can do this in a number of different ways. Your core values can be a word, a sentence, but the work rules are what really bring it home. Now imagine you're a recruiter at Orr's Partners and you're sharing this with a candidate. Those 4 bullets are going to really help you and help the candidate. They're going to help the candidate because the candidate can look at this and say, yeah, I really want to work for an organization like this. Or they can say, you know, this just isn't really how I like to get work done. I don't want to be a part of the growth of the business. I really want to be focused on my day-to-day. And that's fine. Ours is a growing company. They're not a stable, conservative company, and so this might not work for everyone. So what you want to think about is how you can use this with candidates. Now, as a recruiter or a hiring manager, from an employer brand perspective, think about how you can use these work rules. You can ask questions around them. You can look for evidence of this on a resume. It's a really good way to see if people are a fit for the culture. We talk all the time about the importance of culture fit. And the best way to do that is to create your core values, create your work rules, and then use that as the foundation of your employer brand. Put it out there so candidates can self-select in or out. And then when you get into interviews, you can have really good conversations about those core values. It's the same reason that Zappos asks in every interview, tell me how you're a little bit weird, because they want to see if someone can live that value in the organization. So let's talk about some specific examples as we move on to the next slide, and how you can actually do this. So I'm going to have you flip forward to the next slide, and we're going to talk about actually managing this in performance. So first, there's 3 steps here. The first is making sure that you're aligned. Look at those values and work rules and do the research and make sure that it is aligned with the organization, again, or it's not going to work. Then what you can do in your employer brand is you can share examples. Show examples of those values in action. So for example, if Orr's partners' value is around accountability, they can have specific examples they can share on their career site or they can share in an interview. And then provide development opportunities. Where are they working? Where can someone grow as it relates to those core values and work rules? And then last but not least, you've got to, if you want your core values and work rules, you want your culture to stick, you have to hold employees accountable for it. That means you have to promote people that are living the values, and you have to let people leave who are not. Jack Welch years ago was really famous in GE for having his 4 cornerstone model. And one of those cornerstones was people. And if you didn't live that people value, if you didn't make your metrics there, you were not promoted. Every value was held equally. So that's one way to think about it. Let me show you some other examples of culture in action. If you flip to the next slide, you'll see Virgin America's career site. Very, very clear and upfront. Are you Virgin enough? That's their employer brand line. And so what they actually have is a little quiz you can take that says, are we a match? And that's one idea of a way you can actually help people understand, are they a fit for your culture? You want people to find out that they're not a fit because you don't want to waste time in your hiring process. And so as part of your employer brand, you really want to execute and share that culture, but you have to be willing to let people go. You can't be a brand for everybody. On the next slide, I'll share an example from Buffer. Buffer is an organization that provides social media tracking and promotion, similar to Hootsuite. They have a tool that you can use from a marketing perspective. And this is one of their core values. And you'll see, default to transparency, they have really specific rules around what this means, and they promote those rules. They make it really clear. And what they actually did as a way to say, hey, we're not just saying we're transparent, we are, is they actually posted the salaries of every employee as part of their employer brand. Now, that's an extreme example. That's probably not something all of you can do, but you'll see what an amazing example it is of aligning your core values with action and making it a part of your employer brand. And they then went on a PR push to share with everybody that they were promoting their salaries. So again, it helped candidates self-select in and out. The last example I want to share in terms of culture in action is Ritz-Carlton. And what Ritz-Carlton does is they have a card. It's called the Credo card. And their culture can be summed up on that one card. One of the things they have on their card is the promise that they make to their employees. And in orientation, you actually memorize this promise. I can still recite it word for word to this day for my days of working at Ritz-Carlton. So they do a really good job of not just saying, here's our culture, but they put it in writing. Every employee has to carry that card as a part of their uniform. And then they can actually talk about that in the hiring process. They actually then pull it all the way through to orientation. And during orientation, they have a panel of employees, all of the leaders leave the room, and they have a panel of line employees that talk to the new hires about the culture and what it's like. So that's another good example of how to make it live. So to recap for a second, we've talked about how to think about culture, big picture. We've talked about specifically how to begin to diagnose your own culture and figure out if your core values are in line with the reality. And then we talked about the research that you can use to develop out those core values and work rules that make it really clear what your culture is to hires. And then last but not least, we shared a couple of examples of what that looks like in action. Now, I also promised we'd talk about extending this to channels. And so I want to pass it over to Alicia to talk a little bit about how you can use Glassdoor to reinforce the culture. So think about some of the things that you've heard here today. And imagine if you've built out a strong culture, core values, and work rules, how you can then communicate the reality of that and how that parlays itself into a channel like Glassdoor. Alicia?
Thank you so much, Susan. There was so much valuable information that you just covered about culture, and I'm so excited to also talk about ways that you can use Glassdoor to reinforce your culture. So we'll go to the next slide and talk about kind of one of the first steps that I think is the most important, and I think, Susan, you covered this a lot, but you need to include your employees as you start to figure out what is your culture as a company. I always say when I talk about employer branding that your employees are your brand. So the first step is to really get in touch with your employees, get their buy-in, talk to them about culture, what are the pros and cons that they see at your organization, and also ask them, is there anything that's missing that you think is an important quality that we should have? You need to include them in the conversation, whether that be through anonymous survey or through third-party focus groups. There's also tons of valuable information that you can also read that employees are saying about your brand, on Glassdoor and other platforms. But definitely utilize, your brand advocates, your A players internally as you start to develop this culture. And I know it may vary by department, so definitely go to each department and include your employees as you develop, those core values and points that you're going to be illustrating. Another thing that Susan covered that I think is important to touch on too is recruiting. And I actually went to our head of talent and people here at Glassdoor, and I talked to her. I said, what questions do you ask to see if employees are a good fit for our culture? I think this is important. How do you screen for the right fit at your own company? Once you have these values determined and you have those employees that you want to be promoting you, how do you attract more that are like that? And some of the questions that she said she asks is, tell me your favorite place you've ever worked. What was the best company you ever worked for and why? What environment was the best fit for you? She asked them, what does culture mean to you? And she trains hiring managers to ask these questions as well. And then she also asked, give me an example of the worst culture, that you've worked in and the best and why. And she said in all the answers, she's really looking for, is it an I or a we answer? And it's important to have both. It's important to find those people that are self-motivated, depending on your culture, but it's also to find those people that will collaborate with a team and work really well with one another. But you definitely want to be asking those questions so that you can make sure, if your core value is accountability, like one of the companies that Susan talked about, make sure that, when they're going over those questions that they're answering, correctly with numbers that they've been accountable for, how they push the business forward, etc. Another great way to illustrate what you stand for as a company is to really have good why work for us messaging. And like I said, this can vary by department. So we actually have a lot of profiles on Glassdoor where they break it out by sales, engineering, internships, because there's different values that each of those groups kind of stands by, and then overall values and cultures that applies to the whole organization. So that's a great way to utilize videos. People really want to see nowadays the team that they're going to be joining, how those people feel about the organization, what gets them up every day and excited to do their jobs, and how they tie into the overall goals of the company is very important. One thing we're also going to start doing is actually hiring manager videos here at Glassdoor, and we're going to start, having hiring manager videos say exactly, those core values and missions of the company and how those people play a part. And we're going to tie those in within the job description, which I think is great and important. Another feature that Glassdoor has that our clients utilize are company updates. I think that these are great. You obviously, on other social platforms, see a lot of status updates. And the great thing about Glassdoor is people are coming to Glassdoor to decide whether or not to work for you. So the difference with followers on Glassdoor versus other social platforms is they might be following you on other platforms for company news or industry updates or product updates, but on Glassdoor, they want hiring updates, they want job updates, they want culture updates, because they're deciding, are you the right company for them? And some top clients that are utilizing this feature right now that you can check out are United Health Group, Northrop Grumman, Nestle Purina, and Progressive Insurance. They're doing a great job kind of optimizing and using these company updates if you'd like to take a look. And I always say, you can't show your employer brand or your culture without some photos. People do not want to see stock photos anymore. I know I don't. And we live in this generation of, there's a camera in everybody's pocket nowadays. 2.5 billion camera phones are out there. So definitely, have organic photos that really illustrate who you are as an organization, all the fun and great things that you do together, team building, reiterate those core values within a visual. One quick stat I'll give you is 90% of information transmitted to the brain is visual, and visuals are processed 60,000 times faster in the brain than text. So it's a very quick, easy way to say, this is who we are, this is who we stand for, or if you're the marketing team, this is the marketing team, this is who you're going to be joining and how we have fun. Another great thing to do to show who you are as a company and what you stand for is to respond to reviews. 69%, we poll our audience on Glassdoor, and 69% agree that their perception of a company improves after seeing an employer respond to a review. So this is a great way, and I always say look at the reviews on your profile that people are noting as helpful, because these are ones that candidates are likely looking at the most to get an idea on if they want to come and work for you. And 52% of Glassdoor members read reviews at the start of their job search prior to speaking to anyone at the organization. So this is a great way to kind of show them, hey, this is how we stand as an organization. Thank you for your feedback. This is how we treat our employees. I always tell employers, you're not just responding to the person that wrote the review. You're responding to the thousands of candidates that are going to be seeing it. And make sure you have a good mix. We always say bad reviews help you improve your company culture. They help you find holes if there's holes in the onboarding process or the interview process and someone had a bad experience. This is a way to improve your culture. Like Susan said, focus on the best fit candidates. If they're not going to, work hard or put in those long hours like you stand for as a company, then you want them to self-qualify and not come and work for you. And also, it helps show that you engage with employees on a public platform. Make sure you do so in a non-defensive tone and have a good mix of responding to both the negative and the positive. Another great thing to do is make sure that your benefits are up to date. When candidates are looking to apply at a company, they're definitely weighing where the best options are, and your benefits are very specific to you as an organization. So for some companies, it's perks like flexible work hours or working from home or Fridays off in the summer or free membership to, a gym or free lunch or, matching on the 401k. All this stuff is really important to illustrate. And it's people both early and late in their career that are interested in weighing these benefit options. One stat shows that 76% of millennials say that retirement benefits offered by a prospective employer are a major factor in their job decision. And this was from Transamerica Center in July of 2014, so fairly recent stats. So making sure that you're kind of illustrating all those things that set you apart as part of your culture that you really value and are treating your employees well, definitely helps candidates make the best decision when they're deciding where to work. I'm going to quickly get through the rest of these slides so we can open it up for Q&A. But we always say the interview process is, this is the first impression of your employer brand. And I love our head of talent here said, every candidate is a potential customer. How you treat them, really matters. And you need to show that every person matters. They're not just a number. They're not just a resume. And, you know, something else that you said is good experience. If they have a good experience, they'll tell 3 people. If they have a bad experience, they're going to tell 10 people. So keep that in mind as you, you know, think about culture and who you are internally, and making sure it's the best, you know, impression and best experience for every person that's interacting with your brand. For onboarding, you know, definitely, you know, the way our head of talent put it here is that they're coming in and they're meeting you 2 to 3 times. So when they come and work for you, it's really like the 4th date. And they may, you know, they took the job for all these reasons about your, you know, your company and culture and all those core values. This is your moment to reiterate and validate why they took the opportunity. So there's a lot of really cool things that we do here at Glassdoor to make sure that they feel special. We tell them what to expect ahead of time. We let them pick their computer. We have a founders talk. We go back to the beginning, like how we started and how we live those values today. So there's a lot of different options that you can do to make sure that your culture shows through in the onboarding process. You know, make sure you survey your employees every step of the way. The moment they get in, 90 days in, 6 months in, and every year. You know, culture and employer branding is not a set it and forget it strategy. It's ongoing and it needs to be all the time. So again, this is just driving home that you need to include your employees in the conversation. Show people internally, all your employees, that they matter too. Something cool that we're doing here at Glassdoor is our HR team is sitting down with every single employee at the company to see why they joined, what they love about it, you know, and put a name to the face. You know, we get so caught up in our day-to-day that sometimes, you know, people can feel just like a number or just like a cog in a wheel. So, you know, make sure that every person at the organization feels valued. At big companies, you can train hiring managers to reinforce these values, but make sure everybody has a voice, feels heard, and feels important at the organization. Here are just some quick stats on reviews. So over 50% read online reviews, again, before forming an opinion about a company. 87% are likely to go check out your career site. So it's really important to see every public platform. You need to be monitoring what's being said about you. Not only that, but make sure it matches, you know, what you have up on your career site. Because if you have some disconnect, that can really confuse a candidate on what you stand for and who you are. You know what your employees are saying about you, and also know, you know, what your messaging is as an organization. And then another stat, 78% say that employee ratings and reviews are influential when deciding where to work. We have a program. It's 5 steps towards transparency to show, you know, candidates that you're a transparent organization or that you take feedback seriously from your employees. Companies like Salesforce and Deloitte and hundreds of other employers have taken these steps, and you'll notice they're an open company. They'll have a green check mark by their name. And I always tell employers one of the steps is responding to reviews. So if you're currently trying to figure out a strategy internally to do this, you can look at some of those profiles for some guidance and see how these big brands and others are responding to reviews as well. Another cool feature and tool that we have are heat maps. This helps show where you stack up in different areas and how you're rated by employees, and you can actually compare this towards competitor companies, so that if you know a candidate is coming in from Google and you're trying to recruit candidates from there and they're rated differently in a certain area, you can really, you know, sell the candidate on why you're the better fit for them. You know, millennials are very focused on career opportunities and senior leadership. So this is a great way to see, am I strong in all the areas that I need to be? Am I strong in my core values? And are there changes that I need to be made? And you'll see culture and values actually is an area that is rated by employees on Glassdoor. So this can be a great way to see, you know, quickly what employees think about, you know, your culture. And again, you can also do this through anonymous surveys. A Waggle or SurveyMonkey can be a great way for anonymous feedback as well. Reputation word clouds are great if you're a large company, because this will pull out the key themes that employees have said in their reviews, so you can quickly get a glimpse at like what the pros and cons are, and you know, you utilize those as you develop your core values. And make sure, you know, like Susan said, when they, you know, surveyed all the leadership at one organization, they all had a different idea of the core values. You know, make sure that everybody is on the same page about the values, including your employees, and that they really, you know, are seeing the same things that you're trying to reiterate. We also have some great resources if you're ever looking for tools when it comes to employer branding or employee engagement or developing your culture or anything like that. You can go to employers.glassdoor.com. We have Employer Branding Summit videos from Zappos. We have ebooks on employer branding and blog posts every day on different topics that can help you refine your strategy. And one thing that we always hear from our customers is that they typically see 2 times the quality of applicants coming in. And the reason for this is they're really self-qualifying themselves when they apply on Glassdoor because they already have an idea of who you are as an organization. They've read reviews, interviews, they prep for the interview, they've read about salaries and benefits and all that stuff. So they come in way more prepared. People go through less resumes to make a hire, which is always great to hear. We also see that traffic to Glassdoor is in some cases even higher than one's own career site. So 3 times the influence that you can have by putting that messaging up on Glassdoor. And then also they see a lower cost per hire by 30%. Brandon Hall actually published a great report that you can check out on our site on the cost per hire on Glassdoor. It's much lower than other sources based on that app to hire ratio. Easiest way to get started, I always tell employers, is to unlock your free employer account. You can respond to reviews for free. You can update a lot of things, for free, and it's a great place to start and see who's coming to your page and also what the traffic is and, changes that you can make right off the bat. And now I think we did good on time. I think we have about 7 minutes for some questions, so we're just going to glance through the questions panel, and Susan and I will answer those for you guys.
All right, awesome info, Alicia and Susan. So it looks like we have a couple questions here. One of the first questions we got is if we will be sending out the recording and the materials from this webinar. Absolutely, we will send those to you a little bit later in the day. Let's see. All right, so this is a great question. Susan, I'll hand it over to you, and then maybe Alicia can follow up. Can you talk about how you'd address a very large, global, non-U.S. headquartered company? Values established are at the top and are kind of pushed down. The culture exists, but in various countries and locales, it can be completely different. How do you address that type of issue?
So when we create an employer brand or a culture, what you have to do first is have a foundation. So you want to make sure that there's a foundation that comes from headquarters, but that also represents all of the locations around the world. So at Marriott, for example, even though that's a US-based company, Find Your World was the employer brand and the root of the culture. And then what we did is we worked with the different regions around the world to talk about what that means locally. So, in terms of the culture, how do you make sure that it applies and it's appropriate in the culture in China versus in the Middle East versus in Argentina and South America? So you've got to start with that foundation, and I'd recommend starting with the research first. Do some research to get a sense of what your leaders think at headquarters, and then do some research all over the world. At Marriott, when we did the research, I did it in all of the continents in which we did business on. It was a large undertaking. It took some time, and there was certainly some expense involved. But the insights were incredible because we were able to compare the similarities and the differences between continents and between regions around the world. And then that also allowed us to go back to, at a large complex organization, you can go back to your leaders in those different markets. And you can talk about what the differences are, and then you can also help them with execution. So you can let them lead the execution, but you can be really clear about what your foundation is. So start with the research, use that research to create a foundation, and then in your execution plan, in your launch plan, work to how you launch that so it makes sense and works locally in each market.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Susan. And we're just going to get to one more question since we're running out of time. We'll kind of keep moving. How do you make transparency part of your core values? Susan, if you want to take that one, then we can come back.
Sure. So transparency can only be part of your core values if you're willing to live it. So I would not recommend it for most companies because it is a really hard value to make come to life. But if you do want to make it come to life and you do want to introduce it, then what you have to do is have your leaders lead the way. You have to be able to show that they've made some decisions recently and those decisions are incredibly transparent. You have to take big action and make something transparent that maybe you hadn't before. So like with Buffer, the company that makes their salaries transparent. And then you also have to remember that if transparency is a core value, your employees are going to hold you to that. So if you ask for something that they can't share, that you won't share, then they're going to be frustrated. They're going to say, hey, wait a second, I thought one of our core values was transparency. So if you do want that as a core value, I'd really recommend making sure that you're comfortable as a company making everything transparent that you can that's not illegal, right? If you work in banking, there are some things you can't make transparent, of course. But I think that's a really good way to think about it. And then one other thing I'd add, my email, if anybody has additional questions or wants to talk about any of these, you can certainly reach out to me individually at susan@exacqueo.com. That's susan@exaqueo.com. And I'm more than happy to answer additional questions we don't have time for today. And I'm also at Susan Lamott on Twitter. And you can find me there too.
Awesome. Okay, one more question. We'll hand this one over to Alicia. It's referencing the word clouds and some of the reports Alicia was talking about. Is there any way to get this type of data for our company?
Yeah, the best way to get started is to sign up for a free employer account. This will give you access to a lot of that information for free. And then some of the other features that I showed you, like word clouds and comparison to competitors, are enhanced features that you can do as well.
Great. So we are going to wrap things up. We'll leave you with about 1 minute left, but thank you so much, everyone, and thanks to Alicia and Susan for joining us today. A ton of great info. As I mentioned, we will send out a follow-up email with these materials as soon as the webinar concludes. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you at another upcoming Glassdoor webinar.